There is a moment in every revolution when the old rules stop working. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like a door slamming shut in a draughty hall. For the Game of Thrones, that moment came not with a sword or a crown, but with a scalpel wielded by a man who had been thrown out of the Citadel for wanting to know too much. Varys spent decades building something beautiful, something terrifying in its elegance, a network of whispers that stretched from the Red Keep to the slums of King's Landing, from the brothels of Lys to the counting houses of Braavos. He called them his little birds, children mostly, small enough to slip through secret passages, quiet enough to listen at keyholes, invisible enough to be forgotten the moment they were seen. And they were loyal. Or if not loyal, then dependent, fed, clothed, trained, and in some cases silenced, their tongues cut out so they could never speak out of turn, never be tempted by a better offer, never betray the hand that fed them. This was Varys's genius. He understood that information is not power. Information is the shadow of power. The real power lies in who controls the flow, who decides what gets whispered and what gets buried, who knows which ear to fill and which to leave empty. For 20 years, Varys was the master of this shadow economy. He knew who was sleeping with whom, who was borrowing from whom, who was plotting against whom. And he used this knowledge not to rule directly, but to nudge, to push, to make the great lords dance to a tune only he could hear. But here is the thing about systems built on human beings. They are fragile. They depend on trust, on loyalty, on the predictable unpredictability of greed and fear. Varys's little birds were human. They could be bribed. They could be caught. They could die of plague in the gutters of Flea Bottom. They could grow up and lose their usefulness. They could, in the end, be turned. And when Varys fled King's Landing after murdering Qyburn Lannister and Grand Maester Pycelle, that is exactly what happened. Enter Qyburn. Qyburn was not a spymaster. He was not a politician. He was not even, strictly speaking, a maester anymore. He was a man who had been stripped of his chain by the archmaesters of the Citadel for conducting experiments they deemed too bold, too unnatural. He had vivisected living men in pursuit of medical knowledge. He had studied necromancy. He had looked at death and asked not why it came, but how it might be delayed, or reversed, or repurposed. The Citadel called this madness. Qyburn called it progress. And when Cersei Lannister, desperate for allies in a court that had turned against her, elevated this disgraced scholar to the position of Master of Whisperers, something fundamental shifted in the machinery of power. Not because Qyburn was better at gathering information than Varys. He wasn't. Not because he understood the great game more deeply. He didn't. But because he represented a different kind of power entirely. A power that didn't need whispers. A power that didn't need trust. A power that could be built in a laboratory and unleashed on the battlefield. This is the story of that shift. Not a clash of personalities, but a collision of paradigms. The moment when the social engineering of the spider met the biological engineering of the unchained maester, and the moment when the old game ended forever. To understand what Qyburn destroyed, we must first understand what Varys built. And to understand what Varys built, we must look at what he never said. Varys called himself a servant of the realm. He told Ned Stark that his loyalty was to the people, to the stability that kept millions from starving in the streets while lords played at war. And maybe, in his own way, he believed it. But the system he built was not designed for stability. It was designed for leverage, for the accumulation of secrets that could be deployed at the exact moment of maximum impact. The little birds were the foundation of this system. In the books, we learn that Varys had a network before he ever came to King's Landing. In Pentos, he and Illyrio Mopatis trained orphan children to climb walls, to read letters, to steal ledgers, to sell what they found to the highest bidder. These were the little mice, the predecessors of the little birds. And when Varys came to Westeros, he brought this model with him, adapted it, refined it, made it quieter, smaller, more invisible. The children who became little birds were chosen for their size, their silence, their ability to disappear. Some had their tongues removed, not by Varys himself, but by the suppliers who provided them. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was quality control. A little bird who cannot speak, cannot betray you by accident, cannot be interrogated, cannot be tempted by promises of a better life. They became pure information-gathering machines, biological recording devices with legs. But machines break, and Varys' machines were still human. The War of the Five Kings exposed the limitations of the spider's web. For all his whispers, Varys failed to prevent the one event that made the war inevitable: the execution of Eddard Stark. He knew Joffrey was unstable. He knew Cersei was desperate. He knew Littlefinger was playing his own game. But he didn't know, or didn't act in time, that Joffrey would order Ned's head struck off on the steps of Baelor's Sept, the finest intelligence network in Westeros, and it couldn't predict the impulsive cruelty of a teenage boy. This was the ceiling of Varys' system. It could gather information about rational actors, about people who moved according to predictable patterns of greed and ambition. But it couldn't predict madness. It couldn't predict love. It couldn't predict the moments when human beings acted not from self-interest, but from spite, from pride, from the simple, terrible desire to watch the world burn. And when Varys fled, the network he left behind was not destroyed. It was inherited. Qyburn stepped into the spider's web and found it surprisingly easy to operate. The little birds, he reported to Cersei, were eager to be rewarded for their information, regardless of who sat in the Master of Whisperers' chair. This should have been comforting. It should have proven that Varys' system was robust, adaptable, capable of surviving a change in management. But Qyburn saw something else. He saw that the little birds were a resource to be used differently. Not as gatherers of secrets, but as subjects of a different kind of knowledge. While Varys had asked them to listen, Qyburn would ask them to endure, to become something other than human, to serve not as spies, but as the raw material for a new kind of power. This is where the two men diverge. Varys saw people as instruments of information. Qyburn saw people as instruments of transformation. And in that difference lies the death of an era. Qyburn's journey to the small council was not a straight line. It was a descent, a falling from grace that began in the highest halls of learning in Westeros and ended in the dungeons beneath the Red Keep. He had been a maester of the Citadel, trained in the healing arts, yes, but also in the deeper mysteries. The higher mysteries, as the maesters called them, the study of magic, of the occult, of the forces that moved beneath the surface of the world. Qyburn had forged a link of Valyrian steel for this study, a rare achievement that marked him as one of the most gifted scholars of his generation. But Qyburn was not satisfied with the Citadel's pace. The Archmaesters studied the dead to understand the living. They opened corpses and catalogued organs and called it knowledge. Qyburn wanted more. He wanted to open the living, to see how the body worked while it still worked, to understand death not as an end, but as a process that could be interrupted, manipulated, reversed. The Citadel discovered his experiments, the vivisections, the studies of necromancy, the research into what happens to the soul, if such a thing exists, when the body dies. They stripped him of his chain, threw him out of Old Town, made him a pariah in the only world he had ever known. And here is where Qyburn's story becomes instructive, because he didn't stop. He didn't repent. He didn't retreat to a monastery or a brothel or a graveyard to nurse his wounds. He joined the brave companions, the Bloody Mummers, a sellsword company led by Vargo Hoat, a man whose cruelty made the Lannisters look like Septons. And in that company of monsters, Qyburn found something he had never found in the Citadel. Freedom. Freedom to experiment without oversight. Freedom to ask questions that the grey sheep of the Citadel feared to answer. Freedom to look at a dying man and say, not, how can I ease his passing, but what can his death teach me about life? This freedom came at a cost. Qyburn became complicit in the atrocities of the brave companions. He treated their wounds and their victims in equal measure. He learned to work with limited resources, with filthy tools, with subjects who would not survive, regardless of what he did to them. And he learned something that would shape his entire approach to power. He learned that morality is a luxury of the powerful, that the desperate cannot afford scruples, that the only question that matters is not, should I, but can I? When Jaime Lannister arrived at Harrenhal with his severed hand and his infected stump, Qyburn saw an opportunity, not just for patronage, though that came, but for proof. He treated Jaime's wound with a skill that surpassed anything the Citadel had taught him, removed the infected flesh, saved the arm. And in doing so, he demonstrated that his unsanctioned knowledge was not just valid, it was superior. Jaime asked him why the Citadel had removed his chain. Qyburn's answer was simple. They found his experiments too bold, and in that word, bold, lies the key to understanding everything that follows. The Citadel feared boldness. They feared the questions that had no safe answers. Qyburn did not. And that fearlessness, that absolute rejection of the constraints that bound other men, would become the foundation of a new kind of power, a power that didn't need secrets, a power that didn't need whispers, a power that could be built in a dungeon and unleashed on the world. The transformation of Sir Gregor Clegane was not an experiment. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept that would reverberate through the halls of power in King's Landing and beyond. When Oberyn Martell's poisoned spear brought the Mountain to his knees, the conventional wisdom was clear. Gregor Clegane was dead. The manticore venom, thickened by sorcery according to Qyburn's own diagnosis, was spreading through his veins, causing agony beyond description, destroying him from within. Grand Maester Pycelle, the voice of orthodox medicine, declared there was nothing to be done. The Mountain was doomed. The only question was how much pain he would endure before the end. Cersei Lannister, who had already learned to despise Pycelle's limitations, turned to Qyburn. And Qyburn, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, made her an offer. He could save Gregor. Not heal him precisely, not restore him, but preserve him, maintain his strength, ensure that the Mountain would continue to serve the Queen in ways that no living man could. The process, he warned, might change him somewhat. This was the understatement of the age. What emerged from Qyburn's laboratory was not Gregor Clegane. Not exactly. It was something that wore Gregor's flesh, moved with Gregor's strength, obeyed with Gregor's silence. The books call him Robert Strong. The show calls him Sir Robert Strong of the Kingsguard. But names are masks. What he truly was, what he represented, was the first technology in Westeros that could not be bribed, seduced, threatened, or reasoned with. Think about what this means in the context of Varys' world. For 20 years, Varys had built his power on the manipulation of human weakness. He knew that every man has a price. Every woman has a secret. Every lord has a fear. And he used this knowledge to make the powerful dance. His little birds gathered the whispers that revealed these weaknesses. His network of informants mapped the landscape of human desire. And from this map he derived the leverage to move kings. But Robert Strong had no desires. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He did not dream of power or fear, death or lust after women or crave gold. He did not have a family to threaten or a secret to expose. He was, in the most literal sense, a biological asset, a piece of equipment that could be deployed, directed, and discarded without any of the complications that came with human agents. This is the shift that Qyburn represents. From the management of information to the management of biology, from the exploitation of human weakness to the elimination of human variables entirely. Varys asked, "What does this man want?" Qyburn asked, "What can this body do?" And in that shift of question, the entire paradigm of power changed. Consider the strategic implications. An army of living men requires food, pay, morale, leadership. It can be bribed. It can desert. It can be demoralized by a clever speech or a well-timed rumor. Varys built his career on these vulnerabilities. He didn't need to fight armies. He just needed to make them unreliable, to plant the seed of doubt that would grow into mutiny, to whisper the name of a rival commander who might pay better, to suggest, delicately, that the cause was lost and the wise man would save himself. But Robert Strong required none of these things. He didn't need to be paid. He didn't need to be inspired. He didn't need to believe in the justice of Cersei's cause. He simply needed to be pointed, and he would go. Through fire, through steel, through any obstacle that flesh and bone could overcome, and perhaps, as the show suggests, through obstacles that flesh and bone should not be able to overcome at all. This is not to say that Qyburn's creation was invincible. The show's finale reveals that even Robert Strong could be destroyed, by his own creator's command no less, when Drogon's flames engulfed the Red Keep. But invincibility was never the point. The point was predictability, controllability, the elimination of uncertainty. Varys' power was always uncertain. He never knew if a little bird had been turned. He never knew if a secret had been countered by a deeper secret. He operated in a fog of partial information, making the best decisions he could with imperfect knowledge. This was the nature of intelligence work, the nature of human systems, the nature of any power that depended on the cooperation of thinking, feeling, wanting beings. Qyburn eliminated the fog, not by seeing through it, but by removing the need to see at all. When your instrument is biological rather than psychological, when your asset is a body rather than a mind, you don't need to understand motivation. You don't need to predict behavior. You just need to maintain the machinery. And Qyburn, who had spent his life studying the machinery of the human body, was uniquely suited to this task. The implications extend far beyond a single undead knight. Qyburn's elevation to Hand of the Queen, his control over the dungeons, his use of prisoners as experimental subjects, all of this points to a systematic replacement of the social with the biological. Cersei didn't need Varys' network of whispers because she had Qyburn's network of results. She didn't need to know what her enemies were planning because she had an enforcer who could crush any plan, regardless of what it was. This is the collapse of the social contract that Varys represented. The implicit agreement that power operates through relationships, through networks of obligation and betrayal, through the delicate balance of fear and hope that keeps human societies functioning. Qyburn didn't violate this contract. He made it obsolete. But we must be careful not to make Qyburn into a caricature of mad science. He was not Frankenstein screaming at the lightning. He was not some cackling necromancer from a children's tale. He was, in his own way, a rational man, a man who had looked at the constraints that bound other scholars and found them arbitrary, who had asked why the Citadel studied the dead to understand the living, and concluded that the only honest answer was fear. Fear of what might be discovered, fear of what might be unleashed, fear of the power that comes from knowing too much. Qyburn's lack of moral constraint was not a deficiency. It was a tool, a scalpel that cut through the social barriers that slowed everyone else down. While Varys spent years cultivating a relationship with a single informant, Qyburn could extract more useful information from a single vivisection. While Varys negotiated and flattered and threatened to achieve his ends, Qyburn simply did what needed to be done and moved on. This efficiency was intoxicating to Cersei Lannister. She had spent her life navigating the treacherous waters of court politics, where every ally was potentially an enemy and every victory carried the seeds of future betrayal. Qyburn offered something different. Not loyalty exactly. Qyburn's loyalty was to his work, to his curiosity, to the Queen who gave him the resources to pursue both. But something better than loyalty, predictability. Cersei knew that Qyburn would never betray her for a better offer because Qyburn didn't want what other men wanted. He didn't want lands or titles or women or power over other men. He wanted laboratories, subjects, the freedom to ask his terrible questions. And, as long as Cersei provided these things, Qyburn would serve her with a dedication that no bribe could shake. Compare this to Varys. For all his talk of serving the realm, Varys' ultimate loyalty was to his own vision of what the realm should be. He betrayed kings. He manipulated queens. He orchestrated the return of a Targaryen pretender, not because Daenerys was the rightful heir, but because he believed she would be a better ruler than the alternatives. Varys was a true believer, and true believers are dangerous because they cannot be bought. They can only be convinced or destroyed. Qyburn was not a true believer. He was a practitioner, a man who measured value not in ideals but in results, and this made him, paradoxically, more reliable than Varys in the short term and far more dangerous in the long term. Because a man with no ideals cannot be appealed to. cannot be shamed, cannot be reminded of his better nature. He can only be controlled by controlling his resources. And when those resources run out, or when his curiosity leads him in unexpected directions, there is nothing to hold him back. The show makes this explicit in Qyburn's final moments. When the Red Keep is collapsing around them, when Cersei is desperate and frightened and more human than she has been in years, Qyburn's creation turns on him. Gregor Clegane, or what remains of him, disobeys the command to protect the Queen and instead pursues his own vendetta against his brother. And when Qyburn tries to intervene, tries to assert the control that his science had promised, Gregor crushes his skull against a wall. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The scientist destroyed by his own creation. The rationalist undone by the irrational forces he had sought to harness. But even in this moment of failure, Qyburn's paradigm remains triumphant, because the question is no longer whether biological engineering can replace social manipulation. The question is only how to do it better, how to build a more reliable Robert Strong, how to eliminate the last traces of human unpredictability from the instruments of power. Varys would have seen this coming, would have warned against it, would have pointed out that any system that eliminates human agency also eliminates human judgment, human creativity, human mercy. That a world governed by biological assets, rather than social relationships, is a world without meaning, without purpose, without the very things that make life worth living. But Varys was gone, fled across the narrow sea, murdered by fire and shadow in the ruins of King's Landing, and his warnings, if he ever made them, died with him. So where does this leave us? What is the legacy of the collision between Varys's whisper and Qyburn's scalpel? And what does it tell us about the future of power in Westeros and beyond? The answer is not simple. It is not a story of good versus evil, of tradition versus progress, of the noble past defeated by the corrupt future. Both men were corrupt. Both men were noble in their own ways. Varys served the realm by manipulating it. Qyburn served knowledge by violating every principle that made knowledge valuable. They were both monsters. They were both servants. They were both products of a world that had never learned to distinguish between power and responsibility. But their conflict, their silent, never direct war for the soul of the small council, represents something larger than either of them. It represents the end of the great game as we have known it. The Game of Thrones, the endless cycle of alliance and betrayal, of marriage and murder, of whispered secrets and shouted accusations. This game depended on a certain kind of player. A player who operated within the rules of human society, who understood that power flows through relationships, through obligations, through the complex web of favors and threats that binds any human community together. Varys was the ultimate player of this game. He understood its rules better than anyone. He knew that information was the currency of power, that secrets were the weapons of the wise, that the ability to make people believe what you wanted them to believe was the ultimate form of control. And he played this game with a skill that bordered on artistry. The way a musician plays an instrument or a painter works a canvas, Varys worked the court of King's Landing. Every whisper was a brushstroke, every secret a note in a symphony of manipulation. But Qyburn didn't play the game. He changed it. He introduced a new currency, a new weapon, a new form of control that didn't depend on belief or manipulation or any of the social technologies that Varys had mastered. Qyburn's power was physical, literal, tangible in a way that no whisper could ever be. You could see Robert Strong. You could measure his strength. You could point him at an enemy and watch that enemy die. There was no ambiguity, no interpretation. No room for doubt or deception or the 1,000 human variables that made Varys's work so complex and so fragile. This is the scientific revolution in miniature. The shift from a world governed by social relationships to a world governed by physical results. From who you know to what you can build. From the art of the possible to the engineering of the inevitable. And like all scientific revolutions, this one destroys as much as it creates. The old players, the Varyses and the Littlefingers, the Tywin Lannisters, they don't disappear overnight. They adapt. They try to incorporate the new tools into their old strategies. But the tools change the strategists. Once you have seen what biological engineering can do, once you have held in your hands the power to create life and death and something in between, the old games seem quaint, childish, irrelevant. Cersei Lannister understood this instinctively. She had never been a subtle player. Her power had always come from brute force, from the willingness to do what others would not, to burn what others would only threaten. Qyburn's methods suited her because they eliminated the need for subtlety. Why whisper when you can crush? Why manipulate when you can command an instrument that cannot disobey? But even Cersei, for all her ruthlessness, did not fully grasp the implications of what Qyburn had unleashed. She thought she was using him. She thought Robert Strong was her creature, her protector, her ultimate insurance policy against the enemies who surrounded her. And in a sense, she was right. The Mountain did protect her. He crushed her enemies. He terrified the Faith militant. He stood between her and death with a devotion that no living knight could match. But the price of this protection was the transformation of power itself. Once a ruler can create such creatures, once the biological becomes a tool of policy, the old constraints dissolve. The need for legitimacy, the need for consent, the need for the delicate balance of fear and love that makes governance possible. All of these become optional, replaceable, obsolete. Varys would have warned her, would have said that power without legitimacy is just violence, that a queen who rules by terror alone rules over ashes, that the Game of Thrones is not about winning a single round, but about ensuring that the game continues, that the board remains intact, that there are still players to move the pieces when you are gone. But Varys was not there to warn her. And even if he had been, his warnings would have sounded like the complaints of a man whose tools had been made irrelevant, like a blacksmith complaining about the forge, like a candlemaker cursing the sun. The question that remains is whether Varys's methods could ever survive in a world where Qyburn's science has taken root. And the honest answer is probably not in their current form. The social engineering of secrets and whispers depends on a certain kind of human subject. A subject who can be influenced, who can be turned, who can be made to see the world differently through the careful application of information. But Qyburn's subjects are not human in this sense. They are biological machines. They don't have perspectives to change. They don't have loyalties to subvert. They don't have fears to exploit or hopes to manipulate. Against such subjects, the whisper is useless. The secret has no value. The network of informants maps a territory that no longer exists. Varys's entire system was designed for a world of human players. Take away the humanity, and the system collapses. This does not mean that intelligence gathering becomes irrelevant. Even in a world of biological assets, someone must decide where to point them. Someone must maintain the laboratories. Someone must choose which prisoners become subjects and which subjects become successes. But this is a different kind of intelligence. Not the intelligence of the social, the psychological, the subtle, but the intelligence of the laboratory, the empirical, the measurable. Qyburn's intelligence was not about understanding people. It was about understanding bodies. Not about predicting behavior, but about controlling function. And in a world where power increasingly depends on the latter rather than the former, the old spy masters become relics. Curiosities, museum pieces in the Great Hall of History. But here is the final irony, the final twist in a story that has already had too many. Qyburn's revolution did not succeed because it was better. It succeeded because it was simpler, because it offered a shortcut through the complex, messy, ultimately uncontrollable landscape of human society. It promised certainty in a world of doubt, predictability in a world of chaos, power without the price of understanding. And this promise was a lie. Not because Qyburn's science didn't work. It worked too well. It worked too well, but because the certainty it offered was itself an illusion. Robert Strong was predictable until he wasn't. Obedient until he wasn't. Controllable until the moment when something deep in his ruined brain remembered who he was, what had been done to him, and who had done it. The moment when the biological asset became a biological agent. When the instrument turned on the hand that wielded it. This is the lesson that Qyburn learned in his final seconds, as his skull cracked against the stones of the Red Keep. The lesson that all empiricists eventually learn if they survive long enough. that the world is not a machine, that life is not a mechanism, that the reduction of human beings to biological components, however efficient it may seem, however powerful it may make the reducer, ultimately fails because human beings are not components. We are not machines. We are not instruments to be optimized or assets to be deployed. We are mysteries, terrible, beautiful, uncontrollable mysteries. And any system of power that forgets this, that tries to replace the mystery with the mechanism, the whisper with the scalpel, the human with the engineered, will eventually destroy itself. Barris understood this. It was the foundation of his entire approach. He knew that people were unpredictable, that loyalties shifted, that secrets leaked and alliances dissolved, and the best-laid plans of spiders and schemers came to nothing in the face of human perversity. And rather than fighting this unpredictability, he embraced it. He built his power on the management of uncertainty, on the navigation of chaos, on the acceptance that control was always partial and always temporary. Qyburn rejected this acceptance. He believed that uncertainty was a problem to be solved, that chaos was a condition to be cured, that the messiness of human existence could be refined into something pure and predictable and controllable. And for a time he seemed to succeed. The little birds became his. The dungeons became his laboratory. The queen became his patron. The mountain became his masterpiece. But the success was hollow. The control was illusory. And the end, when it came not from an enemy's sword or a rival's whisper, but from the thing he had thought he had mastered. The body he had rebuilt, the life he had stolen from death, the mystery he had tried to reduce to mechanism. So what is the verdict? Was Varys's espionage dead? Did Qyburn's science kill it? Or did it simply reveal that the old game had always been a game, a set of conventions that worked only as long as everyone agreed to play by the rules? The answer is that the game never ended. It just changed its equipment. The players who clung to the old tools, the whispers and the secrets, and the careful cultivation of human weakness, they were not defeated by superior strategy. They were bypassed by superior technology, not because the technology was better, but because it was different, because it operated on a frequency that the old players couldn't hear, in a spectrum that their instruments couldn't detect. But the frequency was still there, the spectrum still existed, and new players who understood both the whisper and the scalpel, the social and the biological, the human and the engineered, they would eventually emerge. They would build systems that incorporated Qyburn's insights without abandoning Varys's wisdom, that used biological assets when necessary and social manipulation when possible, that understood that power in the modern world, if such a world could be said to exist in Westeros, requires both kinds of knowledge, the knowledge of the body and the knowledge of the soul. This is the true legacy of the Varys-Qyburn conflict, not the death of espionage, not the triumph of science, but the revelation that power is not one thing, but many. That the great game is not a single game, but 1,000 games, played simultaneously on different boards with different pieces, according to different rules. And that the players who survive, who thrive, who shape the future rather than being crushed by it, are the ones who can move between these games, who can whisper when whispering is called for and cut when cutting is necessary, who understand that the spider and the maester were not opposites, but complements. Two faces of a power that has always been larger than any single player. The wheel of time, if I may borrow a phrase from another world, does not stop turning. The game does not end, it just becomes more complex, more terrible, more wondrous. And the players who step onto the board in the aftermath of the Varys-Qyburn revolution will find a landscape transformed. A world where secrets still matter, but where bodies matter more. Where whispers can still kill, but where the silence of an undead night can kill faster. Where the old wisdom and the new science must learn to coexist, or where both will perish in the fires of their own incomprehension. Varys is gone. Qyburn is dead. But their war continues in every dungeon, where a prisoner becomes a subject, in every court where a whisper becomes a weapon, in every battlefield where the living and the dead march side by side. The scalpel and the whisper, the flesh and the secret, the body and the soul. This is the new game. These are the new rules. And the only question that remains is who will learn to play it.